Time to go bother some people and ask if they've played this. Second thought, I'll just ask you. Did You Play This is the series of videos I do about obscure or seldom talked about video games that I played when I was a kid. I'll be transparent, I was waiting until a certain game came out to cover this particular game, since they're both in the same series. With Trials of Mana's impending release, I thought it would be fitting to talk about the entry in the Mana series I have the most experience with, Children of Mana. I honestly don't even remember how I got this game. I think it was a gift from my sister, who never ended up playing it much, so it wallowed in a drawer for a long time. Until one day I found it looking for something new to play. I remember this game managing to get its hooks in me. I managed to beat it even, which was less common back then, as I wasn't the god gamer I am today. Now, most games I cover on this series are usually middling at best, but the fact that I was able to beat this one shows some good promise for its quality. At least I hope. Children of Mana's plot is contextualized as a tale from a storybook, taking place in the land known as Fadiel. I didn't know this until very recently, but this game is actually a sequel to the PS2 game Dawn of Mana, which appears to be regarded as so bad it killed the Mana series for over 10 years. So that's a cool tie-in. Children of Mana is part of something called the World of Mana series, which spans not just Children and Dawn, but Friends and Heroes of Mana. This push for all these new Mana games was intended to be a shot in the arm for the series, but ended up being a shot to the chest. With a gun. You would think with a name like World of Mana and this connection between Children and Dawn, that these games are all interconnected, but that's not exactly true. Only Children and Dawn have any sort of connection. Now, I haven't played Dawn of Mana, and probably never will because it's apparently bad. If you want to see a review of that, then you should check Repstugog when he gets to that in 10 years. Anyway, the connections between the two appear to be fairly superficial, which is good considering Children of Mana released 6 months before Dawn of Mana over in the US. The major connection between these two games is an event called the Great Cataclysm, an event that occurred 10 years prior to the events of Children of Mana and affected each of our 4 playable characters in some way. Once you're given a little background on the world, you're asked to pick a character to play as. They each fit into tried and true role-playing game archetypes. You have your well-rounded fighter, your speedy ranger, spellcaster, and brute. For this review I played as Ferric, and only Ferric, for a few reasons. One of which I'll get into later, but another reason is that he's the most well-rounded of the cast and can show off a little bit of everything. I do feel as though such an important decision like picking the character you want to play as for the entirety of the game should be a more thoughtful choice though. You're given stats on each of the characters, but there's only so much an out of 5 scale can tell you about how a character feels to play. I don't think it would have hurt to have added some sort of training area to test out each character before making the choice. Before we move on, I'd like to both compliment and condemn this little choice of character customization. Once you pick the character you wish to play as, you may give them a name and choose between 4 different colors. Initially, I appreciated this, but I was disappointed when the character portraits did not reflect this change. I don't want to sound ungrateful or anything, but I can't imagine it would have been too hard to adjust the character portraits depending on which style you pick. This half measure doesn't sit right with me. The reason for these extra colors is likely connected to the multiplayer mode of this game. If you and up to 3 friends each have a Nintendo DS and a copy of Children of Mana, then you can engage in the multiplayer. No, I have never played this, and probably never will. To give the game some props, I appreciate that compared to most RPGs, you're thrust into the action fairly quickly. There's some light world building and we're introduced to the most important NPCs, but it's not long until you're heading out to your first dungeon. One of these NPCs we meet is a girl named Tess. She's a young priestess who worships the mana tree. When this tablet called the Mana Stone that lies at the base of the tree cracks, she goes to the Mana Tower to pray. Side note, you're probably going to be sick and tired of the word mana by the end of this review. Anyway, upon hearing that Tess went to the Mana Tower, Ferric goes after her since the tower has become infested with monsters. Before he leaves though, he's asked by a group of creatures called elementals to pick one to assist him. I'll go more in depth about what purpose these guys serve later, but just know I picked Luna and stuck with her for the entirety of this game. Once Varric enters the Mana Tower proper, we're introduced to the gameplay of Children of Mana. Now, I'll be upfront and say I'm not the most familiar with the Mana series. Outside of Children, I've played a few hours of Secret of Mana, but that's about the extent. That small amount of time, however, was enough to tell me that Children of Mana both does and doesn't play like its predecessors. It looks like it plays like the other Mana games, but there's some differences. One difference I noticed was that there's no stamina mechanic, making you pause in between your attacks. I'm not disappointed that one's gone though. That was one of my biggest gripes that I had with what little I played of Secret of Mana. The biggest difference between these two games, however, is genre. Children of Mana isn't an open-world action RPG, it's a level-based dungeon crawler. Each area of a dungeon you'll be tasked with a certain objective to find the key, or gleam drop in this case, and advance to the next floor. These tasks can be as easy as breaking open a pot, or as hard as defeating every enemy. Most of the time it's a variation of the latter. The nitty-gritty of combat in Children of Mana gives off a decent first impression. It's fairly mindless, sure, but the sound effects for hitting the enemies and seeing them go flying after a 3-hit combo is satisfying. The sword is the only weapon you'll have at this point, and it's the weapon you'll end up using the most throughout, at least if you're playing as Varric or the Wanderer. It deals decent damage, has that 3-hit combo for perfect crowd control, and is your fastest weapon. It does lack in some areas though. Each weapon in this game has a secondary effect when you hold down the attack button. For the sword, it's the parry. The parry allows you to reflect up to 5 projectiles back to its target for a sizable amount of damage. I see what they were going for here, and I'd be lying if I said I didn't find some uses for this, but activating the parry takes too long to be used as a quick reaction. In practice, you just end up standing still while you wait for 5 or so enemies to plunk arrows at you in vain. Not exactly exciting. You'll probably resort to just hacking them down because you're impatient, and I don't think that's entirely on the player. Maybe this feature could have been mapped to one of the triggers, and instead of being something you can hold indefinitely, have it last for a second or so, and allow you to parry when you're in the middle of a 3/ combo. I think that would let people play a little more offensively while also not making the parry broken. As it stands, its appeal is niche. Upon reaching the top of the Mana Tower, Varric meets up with Tess, and they're confronted by this phoenix creature. None of his attacks will do anything to it, but thanks to some divine intervention, a sword flies out of the sky in an anime cutscene that looks much cooler on an actual console. The sword seems to disable whatever barrier was protecting this creature, and Varric is able to pacify it. Once it's defeated, a very, very, very evil looking guy confronts Varric and Tess, waxing philosophical and just in general failing to keep the peace. He leaves, but not before demanding the sword Varric just got, but of course he doesn't give it over. Once Varric and Tess return to the village, they find out that this event at the Mana Tower, coupled with the cracking of the Mana Stone, were just the beginning of a sequence of events across the continents. Varric steps up to the plate and decides he's going to be the one to stop these happenings and return the world to normal. The remainder of the plot is pretty much just that without any left hooks, so I'm only going to be discussing certain events from here on out. While we're back at our little hub base here, why don't I talk about a few different things, like the art for this game. I thought about bringing the art up first and foremost, but I figured it was better if you all saw it for yourselves before I told you that I think it's super charming and probably one of the best parts about this game. It's a cut above some games with a more conventional anime art style. It's just pleasant to look at. And as mentioned earlier, there are even some animated cutscenes that appear throughout the game. Sadly, these cutscenes were held back by the compression used to fit them on a DS cartridge. They also feature some characters talking, but since there's no voices in this game, it comes off as jarring when it occurs. Much like the recent Mega Man Zero collection, I wonder if the original uncompressed animations are sitting on someone's computer. I'd certainly like to see these in the best quality possible. These cutscenes are credited to Production IG. They're most well known for things like Ghost in the Shell and Fooly Cooly, but they worked with Square Enix before on the Xenogears cutscenes, so they were probably an obvious choice for them. Looking at character designs, characters like the main villain and Tess are probably my favorite of the bunch. The main villain looks so incredibly evil it's borderline comical, but there is at least some sort of theme to his design. I believe he's meant to look like a hollowed out tree, meant to reflect what the mana tree could look like if it was sapped of all its power. And it was, a human. As for Tess, well, if you've seen my Evolution Worlds review, then you can probably figure out why I like her. Most, if not all, the characters had their concept art translated well into the game, but poor Moti here kinda got screwed over. Compared to his concept art, his in-game portrait makes it look like his face is way too small for his head. I'll admit I was snickering when I saw him. I think the greatest strength of the designs in this game is how diverse it all is. There's more than just humans in this town. There are these rabbit-like people, a bathing mermaid, and these little flame creatures who are the shopkeepers for the most interesting mechanic in this game. The gem frame as a concept is fairly simple, and yet it's my favorite part about the gameplay. You have a certain amount of slots you can fill in with gems. Each gem has a different effect, ranging from your standard stat increases to giving your weapons new abilities. The more powerful the effect, the more the gem frame it occupies. So the question becomes, do you want a bunch of small increases to your character's strength/abilities, or fewer big increases? You can also get a bunch of lesser gems and fuse them into more worthwhile ones. The more the gem frame expands as you progress through the game, the more you can experiment with different combinations of gems. At least, that's how it should work. For the most part it does, but this mechanic hinges on the core gameplay of Children of Mana being fun, because you'll get more gems and more money to fuse gems if you engage in the many side quests Children of Mana has. Something I remembered very early on when playing this game is just how brutal it can be. As soon as I was able to, I went into the next required level only to get my ass handed to me on a silver platter, so they probably wanted me to do a few side quests before continuing the plot. Which is fine by me, that makes sense. The problem with this quickly showed itself though when I was tasked to go back to the Mana Tower to complete floors incredibly, if not identical to the ones I just did. What the fuck? Rewards from these side quests can be pretty good, but it just feels like a slog to return to the old levels and hack through dozens upon dozens of enemies for varying lengths of time. Later on, these side quests have a ridiculous amount of floors, with the same missions requiring you to defeat every enemy for the area. These missions don't feel like extra content, they feel like padding. Anyway, to rewind a little, before you get access to the second dungeon, you're given a new weapon called the Flail. The flail swings clockwise around your character, knocking anything in contact with it away from you. In the early points of the game, the flail can end up being just as, if not better, than the sword. Its range is better, and its knockback makes for a good get-off-me tool when there's large swarms of enemies. Eventually though, I found the sword to shine over it. This was due in part to me focusing on sword upgrades in my gen frame, which may seem a little unfair to compare, but even at the flail's height it couldn't out DPS the sword because of its knockback. Sure, I could have given both the sword and flail upgrades equally, but that's not exactly viable until the late game when the gem frame opens up more. Much like the sword, the flail has a secondary ability where you can hold down the attack button to hookshot over to certain areas and bring items towards you. This is admittedly much more helpful than the sword's parry, but I found myself using the secondary attack more than the regular attack for the flail. Upon reaching the end of this level, you have to fight that guy from A Link to the Past in the battle that borders on plagiarism. Like I said earlier, the story stagnates for a little, so no need to recap. Instead, I'm going to skip to the Ice Dungeon, the dungeon after the next. Reason being is because that was my turning point for this game. At this point, I was 4 dungeons in, and the monotony of the combat was starting to grate on me. 3-hit combo on this enemy, then this one. Try to hit multiple at the same time. It didn't help that this was when the game started to throw dozens of enemies at you at once. It was enough to kneecap the frame rate at times. This is also the final level to give you a new weapon before it. I won't bring up the bow much because I found it to be completely pointless for my specific character, except for that one boss fight that you need to use it for. But this final weapon seemed to show promise. The hammer is meant to be a slow, powerful crowd control weapon, like a domino effect. An enemy hit by it will ricochet into walls and other enemies for a fairly long amount of time. I'll admit, it is fun to see a huge crowd of enemies get dispersed and knocked around by one swing. Okay, let's talk about this. I neglected to mention it, but if you are within contact of an enemy getting knocked around or down, you will do the same. It'll take you a second to recover from this, and while you can't get hurt while getting up, you can if you're just getting knocked around. Regardless, even if you weren't hurt, it'd still be incredibly annoying. If you are using melee, which you likely are, you want to be as close to your enemy as possible so your entire sword combo will connect. Sending them towards the wall is the most surefire way to make this happen, and make yourself go down with your enemy. Even if this wasn't an obvious strategy, which it feels like it is, it's also unavoidable at times. I really wish that this knockback wasn't in the game at all. It breaks whatever flow you manage to achieve with the, let's be honest here, brain-dead combat. It's also the main reason why I don't use the hammer unless I absolutely have to. Not only are you most likely guaranteed to get knocked around by your own attack, but the damage output isn't enough to justify how slow each swing is. And finally, the knockback tends to be fairly unreliable. Because of the 8-directional movement, you can't know exactly for sure where your hammer strike will send an enemy. One slight change in direction can change an enemy from going straight ahead to diagonal. This can be mitigated by only using the hammer in tight corners, but that would just make it easier for you to get knocked around alongside the enemies. Wait, what just happened? My health got drained almost instantly. I was on the last floor, and now it's gonna send me back to the village so I can start this. Fuck this. I'm starting from the checkpoint. The punishment for dying in a dungeon can be pretty damn brutal too. Every 4 floors you'll get the save, but a death will send you back to the village to start the entire level over. If you ever find yourself, I don't know, at the penultimate floor of a dungeon and then get brutalized within the blink of an eye, for example, you're better off resetting than starting from scratch, which feels either like an exploit or a game design concession, I'm not sure which. Ugh. This game has never heard the term invincibility frames. A couple of enemies can get the drop on you and cut through your health like a 1000-degree knife. It's absolutely ridiculous. Unless you panic mash your item button to constantly heal the damage off, you're gonna die, and it's not gonna be pretty. The ice physics are really the cherry on top of all of this. I feel as though this is the game trying to encourage me to do more side quests so I can level up a little more, but geez, look how long these things are. I don't want to do this. And I don't need to be fair. I resorted to playing more carefully and made sure to use my elemental secondary ability a lot. Oh yeah, I said I'd talk about these guys, didn't I? If you hold down the B button for a certain amount of time, you can summon an elemental to use either an offensive or support ability at the cost of some MP. The reason I went with Luna above all the others is because she grants a passive health gain with her support ability. It came in handy until the late game when the health became paltry. But even then I wasn't using my MP for anything else at that point. The damage output from the attack fell off way faster than the HP gain. Okay, I think I got every gripe off my chest. Wait, hang on. The status effects. I forgot about those. Certain enemies and obstacles can inflict status effects on you. There's a few different kinds, but at the end of the day, all of them just hinder your mobility in some way. I think the most frustrating one is the frozen ailment. So many times I found myself accidentally hitting a bush that activates the status effect. I ran into so many of these it got really rage-inducing. It figures that I spill my guts about my frustrations with this game during the ice level of all places. Why don't we finish off this story and then call it a day? So within the remaining dungeons, Ferric rescues the spirits of Gaia and Treant, who tell us the mysterious, very evil man is a being known as the Mana Lord. He wants to unleash large quantities of mana onto the world, which will apparently destroy all life on the planet. Thankfully for us, he can't fulfill this goal so long as he doesn't control the mana, so some more altercations happen and he decides to kidnap Tess, as she can help him create enough mana to destroy the world. Obviously she won't help him willingly and Ferric goes to rescue her. He chases him down below the mana tree and discovers why exactly he's doing this. It's actually not because he's evil, it's because he was one of the 2 children of mana who saved the world from a great disaster. His purpose was to fill the world with the power of mana, and what he's doing right now is like an unchecked version of that goal. It recontextualizes the Mana Lord into more of a force of nature, which is a little more interesting than what was originally seen to be. The Mana Lord sacrifices himself so Ferric can reach the second child, the Scion of Mana, who is actually the one spreading destruction across the land. Ferric has to go through the longest dungeon yet and even face off against shadowy creatures of the other playable characters. A 3 against 1 fight is surely to cause some it's over. At the top of the dungeon is the Scion of Mana, which clearly took inspiration from another children-based franchise. Not only is this fight kinda anticlimactic as a final boss, difficulty-wise, but it's also pretty morbid. Look, it even cries. But with its death, the world is saved, and with this event behind them, the inhabitants of Elusia decide that children aren't ready for the power that lay dormant on this land, so they all ship off. Except for Tess, who decides to guard it and the Mana Tree, much to Ferric's dismay. When I was younger, I remember their exchange being a little more romantic, but upon replaying it, it seems platonic if anything. Maybe I was just projecting, I don't know. Thanks to that misconception, I interpreted the ending as a lot more bittersweet. Not to say it isn't now, but it could have been a little more of a gut punch if there were some unresolved feelings there. Regardless, that's the end of Children of Mana. Credits roll, and with that, the book closes on this story. You know, much like, well, almost every single game on Did You Play This, Children of Mana is a mixed bag, but for some reason, this mixed bag hurts the most. Maybe it's because, on the surface, this game appears to be great, or at least good. The graphics are great. The music, well, it's kinda out of my head now, was pleasant while playing the game. The moment-to-moment gameplay may not be enjoyable, but a majority of the boss fights were quite fun. They usually require more strategy than just whacking them with a sword. My favorite is probably this blob thing. Its animations are disturbingly fluid, and it looks like something out of Spirited Away. But the frustrating gameplay and cookie-cutter story bog it down so damn hard. This is probably the most well-made game that's been featured on Did You Play This, and yet, unlike some of the other games, I don't see myself ever coming back to this one. It's also kind of depressing to remember that this was supposed to be the start of a huge push for new Mana games. Looking at the review scores for the World of Mana entries is almost like seeing a real-world equivalent to a scenario where the Mana Lord succeeded and unleashed ungodly amounts of mana into the world. At least now it seems the Mana series is back on track. Looks like all of those prayers to the Mana Tree were answered. Thanks for watching, and I'll be back soon.